Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Just could you give us a couple of more minutes? There seems to be a few more people that haven't joined yet. So we're going to give it a couple more minutes and then we'll kick off. Thank you for joining. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitical and the Cyber-attacks. I'm Mark Belgrove. This is a discussion that I think has been long in the making. I think that not many people have had the privilege or the ability to join a discussion around geopolitical. I think it's something that is covered in the media or is starting to make headways into the media. But I think it's really important that people do start talking about this now because it is becoming very relevant, not only for governments, but also for organizations that are sort of almost hitting the crossfire between nation states. Please enjoy this presentation, but I think that it's really relevant. I'm joined by Nick Frost from CRMG, who's a risk expert, and he'll be introducing himself shortly. Just on to my next slide, which is me. Pre-COVID or post-COVID, really. So as you can see, still can't get to a hairdresser. I'm still cutting my own. I've come from 25 years in cybersecurity industry, been a CISO at Yellow Pages and multiple other organizations and multiple different industries from retail through to oil and gas. I've helped build out security practices for companies like the NCC Group, Trustwave, SRM, and now I'm working at Exponential and have done for the past 2 years, building out their cyber practice. I also have a charity which I like to plug on every webinar and wherever I can to spread the word. The charity is there to help any individual that requires assistance following a cyber attack. So not an organization, just people. So it's out there to help anyone. So if any of your family members have been hit by cyber or cyber incidents, please feel free to reach out to the cyber helpline. We're here to support you. If we could have the next slide. That's wonderful. So threats. So there's plenty of threats. I just wanted to talk around the threat landscape first. So as you can see from this slide, things are changing. So back in the day with RAM scraping back in 2015, you saw that was the #1 attack vector. And you can see in this day and age in 2020, it's not. Phishing has taken over. Everything seems to just take priority depending on how the cyber criminals and the landscape changes. So it's important to make sure your controls are covering these areas and these are taken into consideration. I think a lot of phishing attacks have been highlighted that there is a geopolitical spin to them in some of the news stories, for instance, but it's important to bear these in mind that the landscape does change over time and it changes quite dramatically, as you can see from this diagram. Now I'd like to introduce Nick Frost properly from CRMG. At Exponentially, we have a number of partners that we partner with for their skills and their experience. And Nick.
Thanks, Mark. And hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining this presentation. So yes, a little bit of background. I don't need to go to the hairdresser as often as Mark does, so I'm okay on that front. So my background, I've had 20 years in cybersecurity, predominantly with PwC, an organization as well called the Information Security Forum. I'm the co-founder and director of a company called Cyber Risk Management Group, CRMG. And, you know, my sort of focus, if you like, over the past 20 years, as well as with CRMG, is to try and help organizations shift away from a very kind of compliance-based approach to cybersecurity to one that's much more risk-focused, one that incorporates and really tries to understand that threat landscape. Because that's effectively, you know, where we need to look and decide and determine what types of controls and mitigating strategies need to be applied. So compliance, we're not saying get rid of compliance, of course not, because you can't. But what we're saying is it's really important now to start to integrate and to move to more of a risk-based approach to cybersecurity. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. I want to just go through, I suppose, a little bit, take a look back in history. And what I wanted to do to try and set the scene here, I just want to look at how that cybersecurity landscape has evolved over the past 30 years, because it is important to take a look back and to understand a little bit what cybersecurity looked like 30 years ago. In fact, I don't even think the term cybersecurity existed back then. It was more IT security. But look at how that's evolved and what are the key drivers that have led to that evolution for us to understand exactly where we are today. So if we go back, you know, to the beginning, a lot of these types of attacks had very distinct characteristics. Largely, the driver for carrying out these attacks is very much about notoriety. You know, can I be seen as the, you know, the leading hacker in the hacking landscape? And a lot of the attacks were not particularly sophisticated. A lot of security or security capabilities at the time were not that strong either. So, you know, attacks did get through. I think the saving grace was the fact that we were less dependent on IT. So the actual impact of an attack didn't really have that much of a problem. We could always revert back to, you know, paper-based processes, if you like. What we started to see fairly shortly after was a more sophisticated type of attack, whereby it was becoming much more financially driven. And so we started to see a shift from, you know, the individual hacker moving towards a group of fairly organized gangs, if you like, hacking groups. And because it was financially driven, obviously that started to accelerate the types of attacks. And those, you know, smart organizational groups or hacking groups started to reinvest a lot of this finance and start to develop more sophisticated attacks. And this is when it started to become, you know, a real big problem and the type of problems that we see today. So we are still seeing this type of attack. We're still seeing a hugely financially driven nature in cyber-related attacks. And one of the big challenges that we saw was that organizations still had a kind of a compliance mentality to addressing cybersecurity. And the compliance mentality wasn't really dynamic enough to adjust to the dynamic landscape that we were seeing in cybersecurity. So you would have attacks that were happening that were able to overcome controls because it was more a case of we need to apply to the controls in this particular, you know, standard or regulation. And actually some of those controls probably weren't even relevant. So you were over-engineering your controls, and some of those controls were under-engineered against the types of attacks that you were facing. So we're starting to see organizations adopt a much more, or talk a lot more about a risk-based approach to security. But it's becoming more and more important as we start to look ahead. I think one of the things that we can say is that there's a huge amount of new technology that's coming on board in organizations, particularly around spaces like the IoT space, the Internet of Things, which is going to become a very target-rich environment. So it could be anything from your, you know, mundane white goods to, you know, your car, your entertainment system in the car. These are all examples of attack spaces that are being exploited, have been exploited, and, you know, and will lead to some serious impacts, both to you as individuals, but also to organizations. What we're also seeing as well in the regulatory space, I think regulators are now catching on to the importance and significance around the need to adopt this risk-based approach. And we're actually seeing quite a lot of regulation now stipulating the need for organizations to embed a capability, if you like, for new technology that comes through, that cyber risk assessments are carried out, and decisions around the types of controls to mitigate those risks are a key part of that regulation. So that's good. That's good news, because that's indicating that this is the way forward for cybersecurity. Now, coupled with that, and part of the talk today, is to talk about geopolitics. And one of the things, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but one of the areas that we, as Mark highlighted, don't consider is being addressed enough in organizations are the dynamics associated with geopolitics and how that is starting to influence these cyber-related attacks. And the reason we wanted to sort of get this out there is because when you start to introduce geopolitics, that becomes quite a game changer. You're starting to introduce, a different league of capabilities, a different league of motivation, and potentially greater levels of exposure. So we want to talk about this. We want to also, at the end of this, talk about some practical ways forward to help you and your organization to address this. So that's a snapshot of where we've been over the past 30 years and where we think we're going to be going in this area of cybersecurity. Now, to kick this whole session off, looking at geopolitics and cyber attacks, we thought we'd kick off with a poll. So what we want you to do is, the poll is now open. What we want you to do is to tell us really, fairly high level, what are the threat actors that you're most concerned about in your organization? And I think it's worth highlighting here that, we've grouped this into sort of three very simple examples, adversarial threats outside the organization, adversarial threats within the organization, because, with the economic downturn, there's going to be a spike of these related threats. We've seen this many times before. But also accidental threats. We don't want to sort of say that every attack is highly sophisticated, highly intentional. It's not. Quite often staff are just not well prepared to handle key information. So if you can vote now, and hopefully we'll see the results and we'll have a quick discussion around those. Okay.
That's interesting from my perspective, Nick. I think it was there's a lot of products that are coming to market in the cybersecurity space about the insider threat as well. So yeah, I think it's these are interesting statistics. So it's great.
Okay, I'm struggling to show the poll results here.
The poll results are up, Nick, I think. So it's showing 52% are adversarial. So the number one, 12% are internal, and accidental is 32%. 4% are others. So that's where we're at the moment.
So okay, thanks for that, Mark, because I can't through them, but you can. That's good. Okay, so my view on that is I think that's quite an interesting one, because I think that accidental threat profile is indicative that when we talk about threat profiling, that we can't remove that off the table. We have to. It might not be as interesting as the types of attacks that get reported in the media, because let's be honest, very rarely do you see the media highlight the issue around accidental threats. But as you can see from attendees today, we still think that is a still area of concern. So okay, good, right.
Lovely. So moving on, I think that it was really important, and this is one of the reasons why I thought it's about time that somebody did start talking around the geopolitical side of things. So obviously the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, came out and actually stipulated that he is getting attacked. So he wouldn't obviously stipulate by which country. I think that that's obviously, it makes sense to do that. You by casting aspersions on a country, you could potentially almost solicit more attacks from that organization and that country. But he was obviously stipulating that he's getting widespread hits from another body. And I think that that was very interesting from my perspective. I think it's the first time I've ever come across anybody, especially the prime ministers, and at that level, to come out and blatantly stipulate that they're getting a sophisticated attack from potentially another country. And I know that a lot of our politicians and a lot of government bodies will be seeing this, but they've been all keeping it under wraps. So for him to actually stand up and say it's happening, I think is great for the industry and great for everyone's awareness to really highlight this is the situation. On my next slide, it basically it was announced again in CNN. CNN were stipulating that Russia is attacking and trying to get data on COVID research. So they're obviously trying to pull from the science labs over here in Europe and the rest of the world to try and gain that knowledge and build up their own capabilities to react against the COVID. So again, this is a geopolitical Russia attacking. This was what CNN was stipulating. Russia attacking the world or trying to gain data around the world to help give them a strength, give them the capability to attack COVID and also defend against COVID before it gets out. The next slide basically highlights that it isn't just China and Russia. I think it's really important to start understanding not only the quantities, so it's more prevalent than people might think. So a lot of the time in the media and things, it is just Russia, China doing all these things. I think it's really important to pull out stories and start to understand that it isn't just Russia and China. You can see here from this timeline, you've got Turkey, Syria, yes, China, yes, but there's also India, North Korea. There's a number of other organizations and countries that have geopolitical capabilities that are using them. And it's important to bear that in mind as well, that every news article, or most of the time in the security marketplace, everyone was always talking about it's China, it's Russia. And yes, they do have vast capabilities and they are vast countries. They do have the capabilities, but it's also really relevant for people to start understanding and take note that every country in the world potentially has this capability to do this. Quite often not caught doing it, but they do have this capability. So it's still very relevant. And obviously, Donald Trump likes to publicize certain things on a regular basis, but it was interesting for him to actually do that statement that they're after things within their world as well. Nick, what's your views?
Well, I agree with you. I think there's often, I think the key thing from my perspective here, and it comes on to, I think it might be the next slide here. This is symptomatic of the sort of different dynamics in geopolitics today, and we're all very aware of the US elections, and we're all very aware of the relationship these types of elections have with cyber-related attacks. You know, the media saturated this type of situation. What was interesting a couple of days ago was a news item that Microsoft released, and it did make some media attention. I was surprised personally that it didn't make as much as it did. But what it highlights, what it was highlighting, and it did a sort of comparison between 2016 and this one, was if you like, the attack footprint in 2016 was considerably smaller. So yes, they were attacking, you know, some organizations that were supporting different political parties, but they were also, you know, directly targeting the political parties themselves. What we're seeing now is actually that attack footprint is growing quite considerably. So there are a large number of organizations involved in the, you know, US politics supporting one or, or the other party. And as a result of those, these different countries that Microsoft have highlighted, have a specific agenda. So I won't go into detail in terms of which country is attacking who, or which country is attacking which party, but it's quite interesting to see how this particular issue is polarizing certain countries' views. And we may be talking, obviously about the US politics, because it's almost become overt rather than covert when it comes to attacks. But it's also important to highlight that, we now know from the US, from the UK government, that these types of attacks were detected from, things like Scottish independence, Brexit. So whatever country political situation occurs, there's likely to be some related influence in the form of a cyber-related attack. And what's important for people on this call is you may well be working for organizations that you think are not necessarily connected in any way to your government or a government's particular party, but actually you could well be in the crosshairs of a nation state related attack. And what I mean by that is it could be as innocuous as having a contract with a defense contractor, or a company that's drilling or mining in environmentally sensitive areas of the world. And the reason we wanted to sort of start highlighting this is because when we typically assess cyber risks today, we don't always consider those geopolitical aspects. And we've got a model for areas to consider in a few slides time, but we don't always consider those particular aspects. And in cybersecurity, now is the time for us to at least recognize it. We don't need to go into great levels of detail, but at least recognize that these are key influences in your cyber threat landscape today. Okay, so we have another poll here. So Mark, I'm going to rely on you to read out the results. But so what we wanted to do is get an idea in terms of the extent to which you believe your organization could be affected by changes within the geopolitical landscape. So again, 3 high-level responses. My organization would be directly impacted. So an example there could be, you are a defense contractor. My organization may be impacted. You may provide support or services, if you like, to a government, the UK government or a government overseas, or my organization will not be affected. So I think the poll is open, so if we could have responses to that now.
Great. Thank you very much. We got some responses in. Yeah, 52% my organization may be impacted. 24% say my organization would be directly impacted, and 24% my organization would not be affected. So 24 people, 24% of people think that they won't be affected at all. I think that my organization may be attacked. I think the 52% is the outstanding one here. I think it's important to bear in mind a lot of the areas that we can scenarios we're going to be covering off shortly basically highlights as well. So many organizations feel that they won't be impacted directly or because of the geopolitical landscape, but there are implications to still consider. I think it's the important thing from my perspective. And we're just going to go through a few scenarios and just talk through that. But currently at the moment, it's a 52% saying that they may be impacted, and then it's so 50-50, 24% will be directly impacted and 24% might not be.
Just to add to that, Mark, I think that's indicative, that may be impacted is indicative of organizations maybe looking for some kind of tool or understanding to determine more objectively whether they are or they're not going to be. So I think those results are quite insightful, actually. I think I'm a little bit surprised that the percentage is so high for directly impacted. So, but that's that's also good to know, given the fact that this is a topic that we believe quite strongly in, and we believe also this is something that needs to be included in in most cyber security functions, sort of roadmap and day-to-day activities. So, okay, so we've been talking about, okay, so how can organizations start to assess the effects, if you like, or the influences of geopolitics and what that means to cybersecurity? As we mentioned before, if we take a look at how threat profiling, if you like, is carried out today, we focus very much on, in my experience working with a lot of clients, they focus very much on the types of techniques that can occur. So there's very much a focus on things like, well, are we exposed to malware? Have we had incidents to do with phishing? It tends to be at that level. Now, if we look at threat profiling, you could say, well, you have two key components. One is the threat actor, if you like, the individual or individuals that can initiate an attack. And then you have the threat vector, which is effectively the type of attack we're talking about, that denial of service attacks, exfiltration of data, malware, etc., etc. And it's that threat actor piece that is important, because let me give you an example. If you're an organization that is experiencing a malware attack from an individual hacker, if you like, so they've gone on to Metasploit to develop this malware related attack, obviously that's a concern, but typically that would have the capability that should be addressed by good antivirus solutions. If you have a malware that's being created by a nation state, then that becomes a big issue, because that's going to contain zero-day vulnerabilities that may not be known, and the chances are could circumvent most malware capabilities. And that's where the problem arises, and that's why we need to look at this geopolitical landscape. And what we've done here is we've done a little bit of research around the different types of models, and there's a lot of different models out there to be able to assess and come up with a more informed view around the threat landscape as a result of geopolitics. And these types of models are used very frequently with big corporates that want to invest in big infrastructure projects in different parts of the world. It's a PESTLE type of model, and PESTLE stands for political, economical, social, technological, legal, and environmental. So these are all the different components, the different influences that are used to assess threats and potential risks for big enterprise-wide type of projects. But this is also the type of model that we need to start to incorporate into profiling cybersecurity and cybersecurity threats. Because as we said before, these are the types of drivers, these are the types of macro influences, if you like, that are now having a direct effect on cybersecurity and the cybersecurity landscape. So, it could be anything. If we were possibly from the right to the left here, we could be, an organization that is, as I said before, drilling in an environmentally sensitive area of the world. And that could start to influence, attacks from hacktivists. It could influence attacks from nation states as well, because there may be some bidding war that's going on between two or more countries. And so trying to get access to, whether it's seismic data or reservoir evaluations to determine the size of those, the amount of hydrocarbons, that is information that will help to influence, another party or parties to determine how they go forward. You think about legal, that could be related to sanctions. Countries are often placing sanctions on different countries, and that could, start to introduce some unwanted attention from those countries. So, they could start to look at key infrastructure in a country's, country's infrastructure, such as settlement systems in central banks, for example. So there are lots of these different influences that we don't always consider when we're looking at cybersecurity. And Mark, I don't know if you want to expand on some of this.
Yeah, so I think that it's quite interesting. So I've worked with a number of organizations across Europe. There was a leading manufacturing situation where they were going to set up a manufacturing in China, and I can't mention the company's name obviously for specific reasons, but it was very interesting for me to deal with that case. So the case was that the team flew over to China. They reviewed the factories that they had put forward as proposed sites for helping this organization to set up the manufacturing over there. When they came back to their country, they then had a discussion around the table, and when these factories aren't fit for human consumption, so if it ever got out in the media that they would be using these factories, it would have a real brand damage on them. So they thought, okay, well, let's just ask for land and we'll build our own factories. These discussions were in-house, in closed doors, amongst that community and that bid team. They then flew back out to to China, and spoke to the authorities. And the authorities put down land before they opened their mouths, pretty much, to say, you know, what about these? I understand the factories aren't fit for purpose, but what about these? So obviously somebody had been in their infrastructures, had been able to see the plans and the discussions to try and give them that upper lift. So I think it's really important for people to realize that a lot of the time it's not malicious, not necessarily going to be denial of service, that does happen, but it can be also to try and make sure that economically they are the upper foot, that they are making sure they gain this this work. So corporates and organizations will be bringing money into their country. So it's important to bear that into consideration. It's not just sort of the fighting that is going on between the geopolitical, but obviously on the geopolitical fighting, you do get some horrendous malware. We've had a number of situations where specific countries, it's been in the media, there's been specific countries that have almost held ransomware, denial of service attacks on other people's infrastructure as well. But it still had an economical impact. If you did, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, and you started looking around about countries with good to have your cybersecurity deployments and your cybersecurity services. There were a lot of countries in there, Eastern European countries, that you would have been, yep, that's brilliant. They've got the skills, they've got the capabilities. Until situations like NotPetya happened, and then suddenly their heads came on the radar that they could be attacked, they could be exploited, and they could take down organizations. I think that it was in the media that Maersk was taken out by one such attack that could very well have been, but couldn't actually be finger pointed at a Russian attack on a Ukrainian company. But those things do happen. So it's it's important to bear in mind, it could be a malicious denial of service malware attack, as well as just be an interrogation to understand how that country is going to have an upper hand on another country for a bid.
Okay, good.
So what should we consider? So in my next slide, in the old days, I mean, these are 5 core areas that most organizations think on cybersecurity. So they're always very aware. Staff need to be trained. It is the people, process, and technology are the 3 pillars of cybersecurity. So these are the 5 core, and this is pretty much the order. A lot of people went to the depth to say, yes, training is going to be relatively cheap. It's going to be the ideal thing to help protect my organization. And further down the scope, you've got there your compliance. So those are the must-haves. Yes, I have to tick the box and I have to be compliant in that way. I think what's important, if you just the next area, is how that's changed in my eyes, and I think in most organizations' eyes. I think it's become really important. The number one thing to do is to understand the controls you do have in place. So before buying the new shiny, buying the new technology, understand the way your organization looks to the current threat landscape, keeping informed on the current threat landscape and making sure you do have controls, understanding the risk that your organization could potentially have. The 5 pillars are still very relevant. There is no way about that. But I think once you've got an understanding of what controls, you can also help influence those other areas. You can then understand what sort of malware protection is relevant, what sort of data protection is important, staff awareness, and your compliance regime. So once you've got that full understanding of your organization, you can budget for it, and it just helps most organizations have a true picture of that environment. The next slide. So what can Exponentially do to help? So Exponentially, obviously we're here as an MSP. We're able to provide lots of different services in lots of different areas, but I'd like to hand over to Nick to highlight one of the core ones that we'd like to discuss now.
Thanks, Mark. So as Mark mentioned there, whilst the cyber threat landscape is becoming more of a concern, more sophisticated, there are some quick wins that we want to sort of share with you here. And as Mark highlighted, it's the first place of call really is to get a grasp of those key controls you've got in your organization and to assess how effective they are, because you can't really put a solution in place until you've diagnosed if you do or don't have a particular problem. And the other key point I think to highlight here is, whilst there are these sophisticated threat actors, if you like, with a huge amount of capability, at the end of the day, they still end up with a finite amount of time and a finite amount of resources. So what's the solution? Well, really the solution is to ensure that you've got pretty good cybersecurity hygiene in place, or at least be slightly controversial, at least be better than your peers and competitors in industry. So, they'll see that you're not that vulnerable, they'll see other areas of vulnerability and they'll go after those. So what we've come up with is quite a powerful but quite a straightforward and streamlined approach. We have a cybersecurity diagnostic. You've got the capability of, and this cybersecurity diagnostic is an activity that we perform. We have an experienced team that will come on site and assess those particular controls. But also what's key is not just assessing those controls off the shelf, but understanding the nature of your organization and then being able to weight those controls. So, if you're in retail, for example, my experience with a lot of retail clients at the minute is they're shifting a huge amount of focus to their .com environment. They're still going to have stores, but stores isn't really the future, certainly not for the short to medium term. So there's a great emphasis to ensure to keep that business ticking over. Great emphasis on on an online .com environment. So what kind of controls would we need there from a cybersecurity perspective? Well, number one, availability, because if you're getting hit by denial of service attacks, you've got to make sure that you've got the appropriate controls in place to maintain that online availability. So that's just one example, and that's typically how we approach this. We understand what are the key drivers of your business to then help and define the types of controls that are needed. But once we've identified and reviewed those current controls, then we can put forward the types of solutions that are required. But this can't just be a one-off exercise. You can't carry this out as an annual assessment. It has to be something that's monitored. And in terms of that monitoring activity, we have what we call CRMGI. So this is a screenshot, if you like, of the diagnostic assessment. But then we have the monitoring capability. So the monitoring capability identifies those key controls and continually measures the effectiveness of those key controls. So it's a couple of snapshots of the dashboard and the approach that we take. But the whole point of this is to ensure that we've got a finger on the pulse in looking at the effectiveness of those controls over an ongoing period. So it's almost like a real-time assessment about the effectiveness of those controls, but driven by that initial assessment to determine which of those controls are key for your organization. Mark?
Brilliant. So I think that like you say, the important thing is to draw a line in the sand. So the initial assessment is drawing that line in the sand, which is great. It's a snapshot at a point in time and how your organization is going to defend against the threats. And as the threat landscape evolves, when you know what controls you've got, you know how to throttle those and protect yourselves appropriately. Having eyes on the capabilities as well. So as you start doing remediation, being able to see how that's affecting your controls is really important as well. So it then makes it and brings it to life rather than being an on-point assessment. So at this point, we want to hold it open to the floor. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask myself or Nick, we'll be happy to spend some time answering them.
So questions come through here. In your opinions, does this not feel like a losing battle for most businesses, considering the resources that these nation state groups have at their disposal? That's a good question.
I think that, yeah, very, very good question. And I think it is certainly a thing. I think that, yeah, you're absolutely right, that nation state have got more money than anyone, to any criminal organization could potentially have to throw at this. I think the important thing for me is to get the balance right. So I keep on saying to most organizations, you can't be Fort Knox. There's not budget for it. Lots of organizations, charities, etc. But by putting the right controls in place, you are protecting yourself to your best of your ability. So many organizations that I've been involved with have missed a couple of the basics, which is exposing them more than they realized. So for me, yeah, you're absolutely right. If somebody's wanting to get into you and attack you from a nation state, they will succeed. But at least if you've made an effort and you've got the controls, you're going to be a lot better protected than somebody just not having thought about those areas. Nick, what's your view?
Yeah, to add to that, I think that's, I mean, firstly, that I suppose we don't want to highlight that the sky is falling in on every organization. That's not what we wanted to highlight. But to Mark's point, I think Mark picks on a really important point here. I mean, my view, I suppose, is, well, I think you can do a lot. You can frustrate the attackers that have an intention and a continued intention to attack you, so that they almost move on to another organization, for a better word. But going back to the point Mark raised about being able to demonstrate and show what you actually have done is really important. It's really important for a number of reasons. One, if you're a highly regulated organization and you come under a cyber attack, and that could be release of IP, release of pricing details, personal information, and then the regulators pitch up at your front door, and then they will go through, and as anyone's experienced, will start to go through your program, what you've actually carried out. That's when you can either go down one of two routes. One route could be you don't have the basics in place, you haven't done your risk assessments, you can't argue what the risks are, therefore what controls you do and don't need, and they will certainly provide you with their opinion about what your risk profile looks like. So that's one route. That's an ugly route. You don't want to go down that route. It's painful. The other route is you can be proactive, and you can do these kind of activities. You can even go as far as highlighting, if it's relevant, what you consider to be a geopolitical landscape that therefore has an influence on the types of cyber attacks. And if you do get an attack, well, at least you've got that evidence to demonstrate the kind of rigor and thinking that you've gone through that articulates your control program and your roadmap for cybersecurity. So I think that's a really important point to be able to show and to demonstrate.
Absolutely, and that does help those regulators and those sort of people say, well, at least they've made an effort. You're not going to be able to stop everything. I think that, without saying the sky's going to fall in on people, but I think that it's important to show that you are making an effort. And we've had a situation where an organization, a union, it's not geopolitical, it's political. A union organization here in the UK was hit by a number of MPs. So they decided to do a denial of service on the union by asking for subject access requests. They hadn't got a decent subject access request process in place. They hadn't thought of it. Obviously the MPs had, so they all submitted it at a point in time, and basically caused havoc for that union for a number of weeks. And obviously then the Information Commissioner asked the question, why did they not have a subject access request process in place that was able to cope? So yeah, just making sure you've got the right controls for your environment is key from my perspective.
Okay, we've got another couple of questions that come through. First one here, do you think nation state attacks are one of the main types of attacks organizations should be aware of in the current climate? Maybe I'll start this one off. Yes, I do think they need to be considered. I think they need to be considered for a number of reasons. As Mark highlighted before, no nation state is going to be completely transparent about whether they are or not carrying out an attack. One of the things that we do know from a lot of research out there, there's a lot of research that's being carried out in this area, is that any nation that wishes to carry out an attack may well sometimes have particular links to an organized criminal gang. So effectively outsourcing the risk, if you like, of being found guilty of an attack. So whether we're specifically looking at nation states or nation states induced type of attacks, I do think that's really important for us to consider. I do think that you need to think about, the characteristics of your organization. And I do think also it's important, it's a small point, but one I feel quite concerned about, and I see it quite often. You may have organizations, and for all the right business reasons, make a great big announcement about, they've won a contract with a particular organization. They could well introduce, say, they've won a contract with a defense contractor, and that's great for the business and it's great for the shareholders, but it's starting to highlight to adversarial attack groups an unwelcome level of attention. So I do think it's important to incorporate nation state attacks as part of your threat profiling, but I think it's also important to get that balance. Sometimes there can be a lot of media hype in the news, and I've been there before where you've run a threat profiling workshop for a client. There's been a whole load of news pumped out into the media, and the first threat that's on the list to get discussed is what the media are reporting, and it's not always the right balance. It's not always very helpful. So you've got to, whether you're in cybersecurity, you've got to achieve that level of balance to try and be as objective as you can. What response from you?
I think from no, absolutely. I think that to not think about it, I think is one of the biggest problems that any organization will have in this day and age. To think it will never affect them, again, that's one of the things, the reason why we're wanting to start raising this, because it should be considered. Absolutely, in this current environment, we're all financially, we're all sort of held to ransom almost, where people are struggling with the economy, they're struggling with people and how we're going to cope with things. But I still think it's really vital for organizations to buckle down to making sure that they are assessing these things. If you are blind to them, you can't defend against them. So I think it's really important to open the eyes, understand how you look as an organization and how the threat landscape is changing and evolving, and making sure you're defending where appropriate and spending the money where appropriate, I think as well, is core from my view.
Okay, we've got a question that's come in here. If you're an organization that doesn't have a particularly high level of maturity in cybersecurity, what does good look like to get started? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, start off by getting a professional to give you a quick view. So from my perspective, some experts, like, this is one of the reasons why we partner with Nick Frost. Nick and his team at CRMG are very skilled in being able to help build that foundation block. So the foundation block would be that cyber diagnostics. Then you'll be able to understand how you look and how mature you are, and then management can make a call of saying we're comfortable with that, and that's a fine risk. You can accept risk at the end of the day. So if the board is willing to say, yep, absolutely, we accept this, as an organization, they've accepted the risk, but at least you're aware of it. I think this is my view.
A couple of things to add to that. I think also you might want to think of two streams of work. So, you want to achieve those quick wins. I'll talk maybe about what a couple of quick wins look like. But I think at the same time, you want that parallel activity, which is starting to plan that strategy. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to say, right, we'll get back to you in 3 months' time. That's a huge window to have a level of exposure. You need to do something right now. But at the same time, you do need to have that strategic thinking built in. So as part of that quick wins, as Mark mentioned, you do need to diagnose where you've got gaps, if you like, in your control landscape. And you can then make a better informed decision as to say, well, actually, we're an organization that's heavily focused on providing availability or protecting confidential, medical testing information, whatever it may be. You can start off with some fairly basic sort of, rudimentary concepts like that to then start to determine which groups of controls are more important. But the second point I think is important for quick wins is understand what are your, for a better word, your crown jewels, your mission critical, systems. Don't try and sort of look at assessing the security of every application in your organization. Just understand what are those most critical systems. So it could be Salesforce, for example, if you're focused on marketing and sales as an organization. Could be an in-house database. It also could be, a SaaS platform hosted by a supplier. So, understanding those critical components of your organization, that's a really logical way of doing it. It's one also, and I'm preempting another question that's come up, it's also a really good way of articulating and arguing to the board, because, you're highlighting, this is critical for driving our business. This is something that's got to be assessed first. So that would be a suggested, a simple approach, but one that works effectively. Another question that's come in is around risk reporting to the board. So can the panelists explain what an effective risk reporting capability looks like to convince the board that cybersecurity is key to the business? Want to have a go one, Mark?
I think that it from my experience, when it comes to the board level, is keep it brief. Obviously, but at board levels, they don't like to have the detail, but also don't go into the technical. I think it's really important to make sure that, like Nick alluded to, the sky isn't falling in. The important thing is to highlight this is where we stand. Also, that there are key areas that the board can accept. So there doesn't need to be an expense. So when you've done a risk assessment, it's important for the board to understand, I'm not coming with a begging cap. I'm coming here to you to stipulate that I've assessed our environment. There is a risk in this area, this area, this area that needs to be addressed. If we were to do whatever it is, we'd be able to address that risk. Would you want to spend money on that or not? But don't sort of, I think it's important to say that there is the possibility to not, but it's something that they will need to accept, because otherwise they will just think you're always coming to them with a begging cap, is my view.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, I've had some experience in previous organizations of my interaction with senior management and boards. And I'd say, in addition to that, I think, as Mark's highlighted, a couple of things. You're not in the position to make that decision. That has to be a business decision, because you don't want to be accountable if, the decision is you accept the risk and then you have an incident the day after. So it has to be a business decision and achieve a consensus. So if there's, most organizations will have some kind of risk review board at an enterprise level. That's ideal. That's the ideal platform to introduce cybersecurity and cyber risk. And I would use the term cyber risk as well, by the way. The other objective, well, I always feel that the number one objective when you're reporting risk and trying to convince the board, if you establish a dialogue, even if the outcome is unfavorable, but you establish a dialogue and you get the board or the senior management, whoever it is, discussing these types of risks, that's it. You've achieved that sort of first step in this ongoing journey, and it is a journey. A couple of sort of hints and tips that have worked well for me in the past to establish that dialogue is the use of heat maps. Now, there's a lot of pros and cons with using heat maps. Quite frankly, I'm not bothered about the academic argument for not using them. If you've got a heat map and it introduces a discussion and people can easily illustrate, and as Mark said, don't bombard them with detail, but can highlight that, and then they say, I don't like that, that thing in the red square, what does that mean? And red's quite emotive color to use. It will get the right attention, but you need to be able to articulate that. So in terms of what types of impacts could occur to the organization, damage to reputation, loss of operations, whatever it may be. But if you can articulate that in business terms, business consequences, then you can establish that right level of discussion. Okay, I think that's all the questions I've got. We've got 4 minutes left, and great. I've just had a note say no more questions. Well, I'd just like to say to everybody, thanks very much for joining. I think if you've got, bear with me, if you've got more information, you can contact us here. Mark, do you want to say any last minute words?
Yeah. No, my word to me is thank you very much for participating in this. There will be a recording of this afterwards, and we'll send you through a link. If you have any questions or queries or require any further support around anything to do with cybersecurity, myself and my team are more than happy to jump on calls with you and have discussions. And obviously Nick's also available to help out with this diagnostics and assessments for you. And again, more than happy to jump on calls and have discussions to help highlight areas.
Great.
Other than that,
thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Brilliant. Cheers.